UT Arlington Political Science Department Chair and Professor Dr. Rebecca Deen. Thank you so much for joining us. What did you make of the end of the Texas legislative session? Democrats walked out and prevented some bills like the Elections Integrity, House Bail Reform from actually being voted on. What was your thought on that?
Well, the end of May on odd years is always an exciting time in Texas. You know, it's not unprecedented for the minority party to take extreme measures to try to stop legislation and to force a special session. We already knew that there was going to be a special session in the fall on redistricting, but now it looks like there's going to be one at some point over the summer. I think the Democrats were really reeling from their lack of traction in the last election. So they did not take as many seats in the Texas legislature as they had hoped, and certainly as the National Democratic Party had hoped. And, you know, those chickens are coming home to roost now in terms of the kinds of legislation that the legislature was able to get out and perhaps still will in a special session.
Now, they won't have that same ability in a special session really to walk out because there won't be that looming deadline at midnight. And so what is their long-term gain, if any?
Well, what's really interesting in Texas is that it doesn't always split down traditional party lines. You really have a multitude of different factors at play, some of which are partisan. The Democrats obviously want something more progressive than any version of Republicans are willing to give them. But then you have rifts within the Republican Party. And so sometimes that's on institutional grounds or chamber grounds, right? So we see the lieutenant governor, who is in control of the Senate, at odds with the Speaker of the House, both of whom are Republicans. And so I think the Democrats' play here is to try to delay in the hopes that they can perhaps water down what eventually passes, or in the best case scenario, stop it from passing altogether.
Well, you brought up that point about, the lieutenant governor and the speaker really being at odds. And my thought is, and I just interviewed the speaker just a short time ago, and he blamed the Senate for causing such a delay on Senate 7 from being heard. The lieutenant governor blamed the speaker. And so we've seen that from time to time. But do you think because 2022 is looming and all the statewides are up for re-election, that the stakes are even higher this session?
I think that's right. I think the stakes are higher. And you also have a new speaker. So Speaker Phelan is new to that position. He's not new to the legislature, but he's new to that position. And so he's trying to understand these dynamics between the two chambers. And as you say, it's not unusual necessarily, even when they're in the same party, for those two chambers to be at odds. But, the lieutenant governor is up for re-election, as is the governor. And so they're responsible to the voters, whereas the Speaker of the House is elected by his colleagues across both aisles, but across both sides. So he needs both Democrats and Republicans' support in that chamber to retain his speakership. And of course, we've seen a great deal of turnover in the Speaker of the House over the years. So there's just a lot of dynamics at play, some of which are electoral and some of which are sort of positional or institutional, trying to get the most that they can get from what their position is in the chamber. In other words, the House has a little bit more moderate a view, the Senate has a more conservative view, and so they're pushing against each other and using all of these legislative procedures to try to get what they want. And that includes playing the calendar game.
Let me ask you, because we saw on Monday, Governor Abbott threatened to veto the legislative portion of the budget. The lieutenant governor said he thought that was pretty clever. The speaker said he understood the governor's frustration, but was concerned about staff who could ultimately lose their jobs and not get paid. Lawmakers get paid very little, $600 a day and an additional $221 every day that there's a session. So I'm wondering, what did you make of that? Is the governor playing hardball here?
He is, to a certain degree. He also has his own electoral fortunes in mind. And so he's got to shore up his conservative bona fides. A lot of the grassroots conservatives, supporters of the former President Trump, people who would consider themselves far to the right are not very happy with the governor, or they haven't been very happy with him. They're pleased to see primary opposition. So, it's pretty rare for an incumbent to lose in the primary, but he's got to take it seriously. And so I think to a certain degree, it doesn't really surprise me to see the governor aligning himself a little bit more with a pretty popular lieutenant governor, at least among those conservative voters.
And what impact do you think any of this will have on the fact that there may be several, special sessions?
Yeah, and it's up to the governor. So that's something really important to understand, is that only the governor can call a special session, and then he sets the agenda for that special session, and he sets the order in which the votes are taken. So for example, when they called a special in 2017, which was largely a function of back and forth between the governor and the lieutenant governor, he said, hey, you've got to pass this must pass first, and then we'll take up the other issues that you want to have one after the other. The governor has said really clearly, I think the quote is something like, this is not going to be a debating society. In other words, he wants special sessions to be effective, actually to get legislation passed, rather than to just provide another opportunity to give these things a public hearing.
And going back to something that you said before, and that was about 2022, and the stakes may be higher. When you go back and compare 2022 to what happened in 2018, and if you look, that was when President Trump was in office, and so Democrats were really excited about voting. Now that President Biden is in office, the Republicans may be more excited about going to the polls in the midterms. And so I'm wondering, does that too come into play where all the Republicans, the statewide elected officials know that, and they know that those primary voters are going to be out at the polls. And so this is why they're trying to, as you said, shore up their conservative bona fides.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the rhythm that we tend to see at the national level is during the midterm elections, the president's party, not only the national level, but then down ballot as well, tends to not do as well. So we would expect Democrats in 2022, generally speaking, not to have a great year. So that means that the Republicans in the electorate are probably going to be very energized, excited to vote, and especially when there is an actual primary contest. So for example, you have the governor's race that will have a primary contest.
Mm-hmm.
You have some other races as well, attorney general and so forth, that'll have some primary races. So I think sort of the action, if you will be in the primaries and probably in the Republican Party, and that's going to energize voters.
And you spoke before about the governor's race and the primary, and the fact that he is being challenged from his right, from former state senator Don Huffines of Dallas, and that grassroots conservatives, not all of them, but some of them have criticized the governor really all throughout the pandemic because they thought he was too heavy-handed, and didn't reopen the state fast enough. And so I'm wondering, the fact that former President Trump endorsed Governor Abbott this week, does that take the wind, the political wind, out of the sails, if you will, for Huffines and others in the grassroots movement, given the fact that the president, really came out strong for the governor?
Well, I think that it complicates things a little bit. It doesn't make things as neat and tidy for former Senator Huffines. However, it's pretty early, right? I mean, it happened, around the Memorial Day weekend as schools are letting out, the start of summer. I'm not sure that all the eyes were on that particular endorsement the way they would have been if it had come closer to sort of the full attention of the political world on the race. In other words, closer to the actual election itself. Now, what it might do is it might have an effect on the race for fundraising for money. But I think that there's still room there, I think, um, for the opposition to the governor. And I think the guy, as I said before, I think the governor really does need to pay close attention to this. And he knows this for sure. He absolutely is acting in a way that will increase the likelihood that this opposition, primary opposition, shuts down.
And let me ask you about this race now that's developing for Attorney General. George P. Bush making it official after hinting for months he was going to challenge the sitting Attorney General, Ken Paxton. What do you make of that? And part of his argument to primary voters is that, you know, look, the Democrats are really going to go after this race because they see Paxton, who's still facing state felony charges and who, according to published reports, is under a federal investigation by the FBI. So I'm wondering what your make of all this is.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that the fact that he is alone in his family in not being strong in opposition to the former President Trump, you know, he's much more closely aligned with former President Trump than the rest of his family, the rest of the Bushes. And I think that that was intentional. I think that's an eye toward where the Texas electorate is. I think that we've known for a long time that he's a politically ambitious person. And I think that all of that was very intentional. And it could resonate with voters. You know, I think it's very important to Republicans in the electorate that they keep Texas red at the state level. As the demographics are changing in the state, there's a real concern that at the electorate level, the Democrats might be gaining ground. And so they want to keep that firewall as strong as they can. So I am not particularly surprised that Mr. Bush has done this. And I think that he could mount an effective campaign in the primary.
All right, UT Arlington Political Science Department Chair and Professor Dr. Rebecca Deen, thank you so much for your insight. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.